and losers are matters of inconsequence. In these places, survival is the only thing of magnitude. The men of Andersonville have survived. They survived the 150 years of an indelible part of what makes our nation great, the American people. As I conclude time with you today, my hope is for the 13,000 souls lost here to rest in peace, in the knowledge that their service and sacrifice won a prosperous world and an ever-evolving nation, and that their legacy lives on in the heartbeats of their descendants and the democratic spirit they inspire in those who continue to follow in their footsteps. Although tragic, their sacrifice and service paved the way for us to become a great nation, the greatest nation the world has ever known, the United States of America. It is a great day to be a soldier, and I am honored and privileged that these enlisted men gave me that opportunity. God bless them. God bless their families. God bless their legacy. God bless our POWs and MIAs, past and present. God bless this great state of Georgia, and God bless the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me and stand for military honors?
You may be seated. At this time, I would like to invite Reverend Buckner to the podium to offer a benediction. Let us pray. Remember, O Lord, we beseech thee, the souls of them that have kept the faith, both those whom we remember and those we remember not, and grant them rest in the land of the living, in the joy of paradise, whence all pain and grief have fled away, where the light of thy countenance shineth forever. And guide in peace the end of our lives, O Lord, when thou wilt and as thou wilt, that we may enter that gate and dwell in that house where there shall be no darkness nor dazzling, but one equal light, no noise nor silence, but one equal music, no fears nor hopes, but one equal possession, no ends nor beginnings, but one equal eternity, in the habitations of thy majesty and glory, world without end. And unto God's gracious mercy and protection we commit ourselves and those near and dear to us. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face to shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and fill us with his peace, both this day and evermore. Amen. Rest eternal grant to them, O Lord, and let light perpetual shine upon them. Amen. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge one of our distinguished guests, Mr. Kenneth Cutts from Congressman Sanford Bishop's office. I'd like to invite you to stand once again at this time as the Georgia Army National Guard presents the colors for a second time, and please remain standing.
You may be seated. Throughout this service, the United States flag that stands prominently at the center of the National Cemetery has stood at half-staff in mournful acknowledgement of these losses. Former POW retired Brigadier General Rhonda Cornum has performed the duty of raising the flag to full staff. This honors the service of medical staff throughout American military history and echoes the role that the famous nurse Claire Barton played in raising a flag on this spot in August of 1865. In conclusion, I want to thank the military representatives for supporting this event. I also want to thank the public for their continual support of our national parks. We are pleased to consider this our first centennial event for Andersonville National Historic Site. 2016 will mark the 100th birthday of the founding of the National Park Service, and across the country, our 408 sites will be celebrating all year long. We invite you to join us and find your park. We also hope that one of the parks that you find will be Andersonville. Thank you.
So was it supposed to end? Oh. It goes on the Pacific flag.
So you've been to Gettysburg? Oh yeah. I went to Gettysburg famous trip when I was young. My brother and I were more excited to see the chopper, and then it was closed to be there on a Sunday. So my brother and I went to that night out. I didn't appreciate it back then.
You're watching American History TV on C-SPAN 3. Our coverage of the ceremonies in Andersonville, Georgia, at the site of the Andersonville prison. And you've been learning about it. Earlier today, we had a chance to talk with a historian on this topic. You saw the ceremony, and we continue on with our conversation to learn more about life at Andersonville Prison. Our next guest joining us now is going to be with us. She's the University of Akron history professor Leslie Gordon. You heard her speak earlier. She just spoke at the funeral for 13,000. She will be taking your questions on Andersonville and the end of the Civil War. If you want to ask her questions, please go ahead and call us now, 202-748-8900 for the Eastern and Central time zones, and 202-748-8901 for the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can also tweet us at C-SPAN History, and you can also post questions at facebook.com/cspan. And joining us now is Leslie Gordon. She is with the University of Akron, also the author of the book, A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut's Civil War. Professor Gordon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Can we start with a little bit of what you talked about in your speech as far as survivors of Andersonville? Could you give a sense of what a survivor had to go through? You hinted at it in the speech. Could you expand on that?
Right. Well, in the research that I did on this particular regimen, I think it's representative of many of the survivors that endured the imprisonment here. Once if they made it through Andersonville, it didn't mean that necessarily that their imprisonment was over. Many of them were transferred out. They went on to other prisons. The Confederacy they were shifting prisoners to prisons in Charleston and Florence, and so many might have died there. And then if they survived that, they would go into to parole camp, and that could last weeks or months. And so it was sort of the experience of the bureaucracy of the Army, and they waited to be formally exchanged. And then the accounts of some of the men I studied in the 16th, one of them in particular, this one soldier named George Robbins, talked about the journey home on the train, that he called that the climax of his suffering, that was even worse than being here, because he was in an overcrowded train and with drunk soldiers, and he was overwhelmed and exhausted. So they would go through this journey of trying to get home, and then many of them made it home and then would die at home because their bodies were so broken from the experience and the disease, the chronic disease. So it wasn't just as though that being freed from here and being exchanged was the end of the story.
As far as the 13,000 POWs that died at Andersonville, what happened to them? What does history tell us about what happened?
Well, the death here, so there was this overcrowding and exposure and malnutrition, and that was causing men, they were dying from dysentery, they were dying from scurvy, severe diarrhea. So these were terrible ways to die, of course, and that's some of the things I was referring to in my talk, that the men would say they would rather die in battle. They would rather die being shot and killed in the heat of combat than to die in this slow suffering that seemed so dehumanizing. To them, of course, and it's just a terrible way to die. And that's how the majority of those 13,000 died, from disease and malnutrition.
We're seeing pictures of the grave sites there, and just recently there was another type of memorial service there in which it was illuminated, and to kind of give you a sense of what's happening. You attended that. What was it like to attend that ceremony and see those illuminations?
It's very powerful. I was with Eric Leonard, who you spoke to earlier today, and another historian, Stacy Reeves, and we drove around, and we were really taken aback by that sight of seeing the lit the lights, the 13,000. It really brought home a sense of just how many men were here. And of course, that's a portion, the 13,000. There were 45,000 here that endured Andersonville. So it brought this visual sense of the numbers. It's hard to contemplate that many deaths, I think. It's true for the Civil War in general, so many deaths. But a place like here at Andersonville and the way they died, and so I think that visual image, it was very, very powerful.
Leslie Gordon is the author of A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut Civil War, also a history professor at the University of Akron. Susan from Stillwater, New York, is our first call for you, Professor Gordon. Susan, go ahead.
Hi. I have a great-great cousin who died at Andersonville April 22nd, 1864. His death was listed as dynasty, but I later read a book that said a lot of the people that they listed dying from dynasty really died from gangrene. Is that possible?
Well, I think more of the deaths were from from dysentery, which was this, which was related again to malnutrition. But it could have. I mean, the gangrene, that was usually related to open wounds. It certainly could happen from something like scurvy, which would lead to sores. So I don't know that. My sense of things that it was more often to this sort of malnutrition that led to this kind of a breakdown in the digestive system. But I don't know that gangrene was certainly a concern here. I can't say for sure that it was one thing or another, but that's also, of course, a very nasty way to die. And gangrene was a serious problem. If you were wounded in battle, that was often what happened. It wasn't the wound itself; it was the infection that came later.
From Rochester, New York, this is David. Go ahead.
Dr. Gordon, it's an honor to speak to you. I read William Marvel's book on Andersonville. Do you consider that the best book, or do you recommend any other books, history books on Andersonville? And also, have you read the novel Andersonville by McKinley Cantor? And if so, do you recommend it? Thank you.
Well, thank you. William Marvel's book, I think, still stands as the best comprehensive history of the prison. There are some others. Lonnie Spear's book is very, very good as a sort of overview of prisons also. But there's been some good books that have started to look at the memory of the prison and the effects of, and also POWs. And Brian Jordan just did a great book about Union veterans in general, and he has a chapter in there on the ex-prisoners and what happened to them when they came home. Marvel is very dismissive of a lot of the post-war writings of the prisoners, and I'm not as questioning of them. In particular, one member of the 16th, Robert Kellogg, he's very dismissive of. So, I don't agree with everything that Marvel has to say, but it's a very important book. I think it's a good place, certainly, to start and then to move from there. But I think there's much that we need to learn and explore about the very topic of Civil War prisons. It's really being neglected as a topic. I have read McKinley Cantor's book. I read it many, many years ago when I first became interested in the Civil War. McKinley Cantor was an important author to me as a teenager. I haven't read it probably in more than 30 years. And I think it's significant in reminding us of the everyday soldiers. But I would go back to some of these other historians for more of the factual information. But I think, reading those together do give you a sense of the reality of the suffering here and the magnitude of it.
So what do we learn about prison life, especially at Andersonville, by your study of the 16th Connecticut? What kind of specifics did you glean from that?
Well, what was so interesting and important, I think, about the experience of the 16th, they begin their service at Antietam, and they're green troops, and they panic and run off the field, essentially, and that's the beginning of their Civil War service. But they never get another chance to sort of redeem themselves just because of circumstance. They're transferred out of active service, and they're captured at the Battle of Plymouth in April of 1864, and they end up here. So those are the two bookends of their Civil War service. Panicking and fleeing at the Battle of Antietam, and then imprisonment here at Andersonville. So for them as Civil War soldiers, the story here is hugely significant, and I argue that this becomes a redemption narrative for them. What happens to them here, the suffering they experience, for them, they want that to be as good as fighting at Gettysburg, as good as experiencing Chancellorsville or Vicksburg. Yes, they're Union veterans, and yes, they were on the winning side, but they want to also be counted as victors, even though they can't show the same battle scars that their other comrades could. And it's difficult because ex-POWs really weren't seen and perceived as the same as other veterans. And this is true for not just the 16th Connecticut. So in my book, I'm really exploring how they coped with the experience here and how they wanted the memory to be crafted. And this was a lingering issue for them. And they came back here, the veterans, the survivors, many of them in the early 1900s, to commemorate the monument to their state. And I argue that this is really a monument to their regiment because they spearheaded the effort. They led the state commission. They were mostly manned the monument commission. And one of their members, Robert Kellogg, was very, very influential in the also in the effort. And so this was so important to them that people remember what happened here and not forget it. And
Professor Gordon, as part of that, there was a casket during the ceremony. If we understand it, there were paper stars in there to the tune of 13,000. Yes, that was really remarkable. Yes, I didn't get to see the actual stars. I saw some photographs online of the stars. I understand they were from children all over that sent them in. And then, of course, seeing the casket was quite moving with the military honors here today. And we're looking at some video of those stars. Leslie Gordon is our guest to talk about Andersonville. This is David from Friendswood, Texas. Go ahead.
Hello, great program, by the way. I think this is what television should be all about. I think I saw it was on the History Channel that right when Andersonville was built, the North stopped the prisoner exchange program, and that more than anything else contributed to the suffering, much of the suffering and death at Andersonville. And I was wondering, one, if that is true, and two, if it is, did the North know about Andersonville, and why didn't they reinstitute the prisoner exchange program? I'll hang up and listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Yes, the exchange program had stopped by the time Andersonville was opened. The Confederacy had these overwhelming numbers of prisoners, and they had nowhere to put them anymore in the Richmond prisons, and so they built Andersonville to deal with it. And it never was meant to hold as many prisoners as it did. And so there were the blame for Andersonville. That there are a lot of there's a lot of blame to go around, certainly, but the Confederacy was well aware of how bad the conditions were. I think Henry Wirz, played his role. Certainly, he was tried and found guilty for the conditions here. He did not have control over everything that was going on here. He had a superior, John Winder, who also I think can be charged with some of the responsibility. He dies, though, before the war ends. But the North, as far as this question of what was going on the Union side and how much did they know, there's a book by Charles Saunders who's very, very critical, not just of the Confederate authorities and how much they knew of the conditions here, but of the Union authorities, of Lincoln and Stanton. And I think it's a compelling case that the War Department in particular, they began by the summer of 1864. They knew exactly what was going on here. They were getting accounts. And of course, Sherman starts to make his way here into Georgia with his campaign toward Atlanta. And he is also aware, and there's some plans. He allows for one attempt to free the soldiers and the prisoners, and that fails. But there is an acknowledgement by Grant, by Sherman, by Lee, and Stanton that they want to end this war. They want to win the war, and that's the best way to free the prisoners. And also the fact that the Confederates refused to accept black troops as prisoners, to treat them as prisoners of war, and that of course played a huge role in the the prison policy of the Union. So that cannot be negated in this whole question of who's to blame here. I think that the conditions, 1 in 3 men were dying here, and it didn't have to happen. The things that could have been done. But yes, the Union made a conscious decision that they were going to fight the war and look forward to ending the war as quickly as possible. There's an argument that Grant made that if he had put forces on the ground to come here and liberate the prisoners, that would have taken away from his larger strategy of winning the war.
For Leslie Gordon, David from Utah. Go ahead.
Yes, the National Park website for Andersonville lists 32 people, Union soldiers, who successfully escaped from Andersonville, and my distant relative was one of them. His name is John Eager. I just wondered by chance if she knew anything about him. I know he ended up dying in Ohio at a military hospital in 1878. He got an invalid pension for leg injuries that he developed while he was at Andersonville. But anyway, I know it's a long shot, but I just wondered if she knew anything about him.
No, I'm sorry I don't, but that's quite a remarkable story. And there were not that many escapes. It was very hard to get out of here, so that's something that your relative did make it out. And I think it also speaks to, as you said, that he still suffered from the experience of being here. There were escapes. I know from the 16th that some of the officers, of course officers weren't kept here, but some officers that ended up in Charleston, for example, they escaped. There's been some new work done on this question of escaped prisoners, and we need more work on this. We don't know as much about these stories. So no, I don't know. I'm sorry about your relative.
Were escapes slow because of the structure of the building, or were there other factors to consider?
As far as how hard it was to escape?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Well, this also speaks to, I think, this question of blame. I mean, Wirtz had this place pretty well fortified. Yes, there were, the men, the Georgia militia or guards that were here. It was difficult to have that many. The manpower question is a real one as far as the Confederacy. Who could they spare to guard prisons like this one? But nonetheless, there were trenches built, earthworks built, and there were artillery pieces set up surrounding the prisoners so that they could be fired. And there were threats made. There were rumors that some of the men in the 16th talk about that they were going to be fired on. Artillery was going to be unleashed on the prisons. Because of behavioral problems, because of the men were constantly looking for ways to get out. They were digging, looking for ways to get out. There were also, there were dogs that were used, and of course there's the infamous deadline. So it was not an easy place to try to escape from. And of course the conditions of the prisoners themselves, they were so weak and sick to even contemplate physically trying to break their way out. And this was the middle of nowhere. It was a very isolated location, and purposely so. If you escape from a prison in Charleston or Richmond, it was easier to get to Union lines. It's hard to, until Sherman makes his way down here, you're going to have to travel pretty far to make your way to Union lines.
Here's PJ from Staten Island, New York.
Hi, Professor Gordon. Thank you for taking my call. We talked a little bit before about blame, and I was wondering, throughout the beginning of the war, there was a policy of prisoner exchange. And when Grant and Lincoln realized that this would be a sheer war of attrition, that policy was ended. Do you think ending that policy contributed to the increased population of prisoners in Andersonville?
Right, and that is the question, right? And it was this in this point that Lincoln and Grant and Stanton started to appreciate that if these exchanges continued, that men, that Confederates exchange would go back into the army, right? But it also was this question of, as I said, how the Confederacy was, they refused, once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, became law on January 1st, 1863, the Confederacy refused to treat black troops as prisoners of war. They declared black troops as fugitives. Fugitive slaves. And so this also played a role in the policy decisions. And thus, yes, I think it's a combination of issues. But again, I think you also have to take into the fact that by the time you get to 1864, this war, not only, this war had become a much vaster, larger, harder war than anybody had expected. So even when the war started, very few people had thought about the question of prisoners. It just really had not been carefully considered and planned, and so thus we ended up with these situations, not just here in Andersonville, but in these other prisons. This obviously was the worst and the deadliest, and again, there were specific reasons why it was the deadliest.
Next is Dave, Alpharetta, Georgia. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. I watched the ceremony this afternoon, and I was curious, unless my eyes deceived me, was the casket in front of the lectern draped in a 48-star flag, or am I in error? I'll await your comment.
Gosh, I was behind, so I don't know. I don't know if they had a flag that would have been that wasn't a 50-star flag. I'm sorry, I don't know.
So, Professor, tell us a little bit about, we hear about in the modern day military how a soldier transfers to civilian life in the process there. What was it like for a transfer to civilian life for those who left Andersonville? And if there's examples that you can give us from the 16th Connecticut that might help us understand that.
Yes, the transition wasn't always easy. For the one example I think of as a good one is Robert Kellogg, who he joined when he was 18 years old, so he's a very young man still when he comes home and survives Andersonville. He comes back to his home state, and he returns to his original pre-war job as a druggist. He's working in a drugstore in Norwich, Connecticut, and he still kept a diary for a few months in the early part of his return home. And he says that he feels very isolated. He's feeling like nobody understands him, that he doesn't have any friends anymore. And a local deacon died that he knew, and he mentioned in his diary that death seems to have no meaning anymore. After experiencing all the suffering and death here, somehow it doesn't matter that this man died. Now, he will marry, he will have a family, he will leave Connecticut. He moves to Ohio and sells insurance. And by all accounts, he's a successful man. He lives until 1935. So he lives a very long life. He's very active in veteran activities with the 16th Connecticut. And he doesn't keep a diary, so the records that I have on him are mainly letters, particularly to his comrades. So, part of that isolation he was feeling, he does get back in contact with a lot of his friends from the regiment, and this is vitally important to him. And I think this is what helped him find his way, and sort of get back into what I'm sure felt like some sense of normalcy. But another example is Ira Forbes, who was a very close friend of Robert Kellogg, and he originally wanted to go to Yale, wanted to be a theologian, wanted to study to study religion. He comes back and does go to Yale and ends up deciding to go into journalism. It's not really clear why. And he has a successful journalism career. Like Robert Kellogg, again, it would seem that he has done well professionally, but clearly there are demons haunting him. He becomes alienated from his comrades, so much so that they don't invite him here in the early 1900s, in 1907, to dedicate the monument here, which is very dramatic that he's not included. He was a vital member of the unit. He helped save the flag of the unit at Plymouth. I would argue he was one of the true heroes of the unit, but he became estranged from his comrades. He was arguing with them about what really happened, not just here at Andersonville, but what happened at Plymouth. And he had a falling out with them. He will be committed to the Hartford Asylum for the Insane. He will be declared mentally ill, and he dies there when he's 68 years old. So to me, those are two examples of men that, in many ways, they're about the same age. They're 18 and 19 years old, and they seem to start at the same place, but they veer off in different ways. And I can't prove, of course, that Forbes' mental illness is directly tied to his Civil War experience, and particularly his imprisonment. But you have to wonder. It seems that it played a role.
Leslie Gordon, those are survivors. You're sitting in front of the cemetery there. Are there those who died at Andersonville or left who are unknown?
Yeah, the best estimates are that there's about 500 unknown graves here, but the right after the prison closed and then going forward in the post-war period, there was this national effort to identify the dead here, and the prisoners were part of that. The survivors were part of that. They were intent on ensuring that the dead here were remembered and the names were put on the graves. And Doris Atwater, who was here, he was part of that. And Clara Barton was very, very active, as many people know. And so this became really crucial. There's a movement across the country, both north and south, to bury the dead, to commemorate the dead. But here at Andersonville, it was especially significant that the dead here, as I said, that they be identified and accounted for. And so if you think about it, for those 13,000, that 500 of them aren't named, in some ways it's remarkable given the way they died and the conditions.
Our next call is Greenville, South Carolina. Here is James.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the food situation at the Andersonville prison. The South had a shortage of food at certain times, I think, and wondered how that affected the prison. And did the prisoners have any kind of shelter to live under?
Well, the food for the prisoners was particularly poor. This area of Georgia had been relatively untouched by the war, again, before Sherman came here. And this was surrounded, this was farmland, and these farms here certainly could have, been able to provide food for the prisoners. There were problems with getting good quality food to the prisoners, and I think that's where the question of who's responsible. Some of that, Henry Wirtz, and I think that plays at his feet. And there were some things again that he could control and he could not control. This question of getting food into the prisons. Whether they were being, fed well, they were getting really low quality, and it wasn't anything. They were. Robert Kellogg talks about the fact, of course, they're not getting any kind of vegetables, and this is part of the reason they're getting scurvy. So that clearly could have made a tremendous difference, for them. And yes, no doubt. I mean, this is an issue for the Confederacy, but it's parts of the Confederacy, where the war is most affecting, where armies are moving, and the Confederacy as a bureaucracy did have these issues. It wasn't always, the Confederacy was an agricultural nation and they produced farm goods, but could they get those goods transferred, whether they were to their own soldiers in the field or whether they were to prisoners? That was often the challenge, and that was a difficult challenge the Confederates faced.
Cindy is from Knoxville, Tennessee, and go ahead, Cindy.
Hi, Miss Gordon. I was wondering were the conditions between Andersonville and Camp Douglas in Chicago? And thank you. I love the program.
Well, now Andersonville was the worst. It was the deadliest. Again, it had the highest death rate. I don't know as much about Camp Douglas. In my own research, the northern prisons, none of them. The last caller, and I forgot to respond. That he had asked about whether there was shelter. The difference too with Andersonville compared to these other locations like Camp Douglas, Johnson's Island, the northern prisoners were at either camps of instruction or former forts, United States forts that had built before the Civil War. Andersonville is unique because it was located here in this open area, and there was nothing. There was no structure here, and so the men came in here if they happened to make it in with any kind of coverings, and they would use that. And of course, there was preying on by the men themselves with the raiders and what have you. So they only had whatever they could use, whatever they literally had on their backs for covering. So that was a unique difference that Andersonville had compared to the northern prisoners like a Camp Douglas, which and certainly the death rates at those northern prisons still was higher than it ever should be, but it didn't compare with Andersonville.
You're watching American History TV. Leslie Gordon is our guest. She's a history professor at the University of Akron and the author of A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut's Civil War. Leslie Gordon, our previous guest earlier, talked about how soldiers in the camp would look out for each other, especially once they were put in there. Did you see that amongst the 16th?
Yes, very much. They talk about that. And some of them admit, so you could take a parole, you could accept a parole from the Confederates to, so this meant a few different things. It could mean you could go outside the pen, you could get better food, you could work in the hospital, you could do work for Henry Wirtz, whether it meant being a clerk for him or some specific job he needed done. And a couple of the soldiers, I believe it's John Cusner, tells this story in his post-war account that a good friend of his took a parole to work outside the pen here and it gave him some extra food so he could bring some food back into the pen for Cuzner. And Cuzner claims that that kept him alive, that there's no way he would have lived if his friend hadn't gotten those extra rations. So, and there are other examples of that. And so they were incredibly dependent on those kind of friendships and relationships throughout. I do think that made such a difference. And they really tried to keep tabs on each other while they were here, keep tabs on how each other, how they were faring. Of course, when a member of the regiment died, many of them would take note of it in their diaries. It was important for them, it seemed, of course, not only just to keep record of it, to also talk about how they died and the day they died, the moment they died, so that I'm sure they were thinking ahead so that they could tell their families when they, thinking ahead to that hopefully they made it home and then they could bring some closure to their families that they were there when that one comrade passed away.
Glenn is in Riverdale, Georgia. You're on with our guest, Leslie Gordon. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Gordon. I was involved in the filming of the movie Andersonville, and I was the Confederate Sergeant of the Guard. And we filmed one scene there where the Confederates were asking the prisoners to join the Confederate Army to get freedom and to serve them for freedom. And now we all wondered whether that was a real true story or not. Do you have any information about that?
It's true. It's true. And it happened. It didn't happen, a lot, but it happened. It was denied. In the post-war, most of the survivors would claim, and you even see it here on the monuments, death before dishonor, because they're sort of, in the post-war memory, there was this compelling desire to not want to mention and remember that anybody had accepted that kind of offer and served essentially the enemy and accepted the offer to serve in the Confederate Army. But it happened. And for the 16th Connecticut, I found that some members, not as much here at Andersonville, but in Florence. And somebody recently contacted me to show me that he had a list of a few names, specific names from the roster of men that accepted the offer and served in the South Carolina unit. And I think for them it was a moment of desperation. I think they really believed that it was either take the offer or they were going to die. I think that's what it came down to. And that I think is the context for this. And the Confederate Army, of course, was looking for men. And so they came through these prisons and into Andersonville and made those offers.
Michael from Camptown, Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
Yes, I have for Professor Gordon thoughts about whether or not the Andersonville is a product of the Lincoln's policy of total war, of attrition with Sherman and all of that, the Elmira extermination camp and so forth, that was later copied by Queen Victoria in the Boer War, but the Boer War was even worse because they included soldiers, women, and children. Will you comment on those, please? And are you related to General Gordon? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. No, I'm not. My grandfather changed our name from Gazansky. I'm not a Gordon. That goes back to John B. Gordon. So I can't say enough. I don't know about the comparison you're making. You're suggesting to the Boer War. This question about total war that has intrigued Civil War historians, I think no doubt, and about attrition. And that's the broader point I was trying to make earlier, that I think in the scope of things, that I think if we need to acknowledge that Lincoln was aware of what was going on here. There's evidence of that he, I think he had to feel, and Stanton as well, and these other generals, that even though this was a horrendous situation, I mean, this I guess would be his calculation, that to end the war, to win the war, this would free the prisoners and end their misery. And this is what Sherman explains in his own memoirs, that when he's getting close to Andersonville and he allows this one raid to come here and it fails, that he doesn't want to lose sight of what his bigger bigger prizes. By 1864, I think there was that sense. Certainly Lincoln had it that the Confederates are still fighting. They're all in, right, in Virginia, here in Georgia, and these other places. But there's signs of weakening, and it does become a war of attrition. And so, but that doesn't, obviously, that we can't, that doesn't lose. I don't think the men here, from their perspective, they felt this could not stand, that their suffering had to be recognized and could not be seen as just, this is, part of total war and part of the experience of war. So these are these complicated questions I think are important to try to take into account, that it's hard to come out with an easy answer to.
Let's hear from Frank in Atlanta, Georgia.
Professor, thank you very much for such a lovely program. I had a third great-grandfather by the name of Joseph Walsh, was taken prisoner. He was with the Massachusetts 5th Volunteers. He was taken prisoner by the Confederates in 1862 and moved into a camp. We don't know which camp, and we don't know what camp had a great number of volunteers from Massachusetts that were incarcerated where they were. But he was given an option. This goes back to stories we've been told in some writings in our family Bible. He was given an option to lessen his punishment, kind of improve his conditions, if he were to agree to work with the Confederates to ply the trade. His trade happened to be harness maker, and he agreed to do that. And he wrote in the journal that he did it not to support the Confederates, but to guarantee that he would be coming home after the war, basically to improve his living conditions. And I'm wondering if you found any evidence of any prisons in your research where this was a common practice.
Well, I think you're speaking to this very point and how these men came to terms with the decisions they made. The decision is similar to your ancestor. I know, again, with my work on the 16th, there's one particular soldier, Oliver Gates, who in his diary, there's one section where he's extremely critical of men that took these paroles, again, to work in the cookhouse, to work in the hospital. Some of them worked as shoemakers, which was a highly valued trade for the Confederacy. They wanted, help making shoes. And so, he was extremely angry and bitter about this, that this was a shame, this was so shameful, and again, death before dishonor. And then the last page of his diary, he confesses that he accepted a parole when he was at, I think it's at Florence, to work in the hospital. And he says he did it to stay alive, so he could come home to his wife and his daughter. And he says that he regrets that he was so judgmental of his comrades, that no one should do that no one should try to assume they know what it's like to be in that position. And again, I think it speaks to this gut-wrenching torment that these prisoners were going through, whether it was this prison or these other prisons, when they're feeling that they've been forgotten in many cases. They don't really have a sense of the big picture, whether it's a question of, is this total war, is this attrition, is there an exchange going on? All they know is they're trying to survive, and they no longer can consider these abstract questions of patriotism and duty, and even questions about the Union or abolition. They just are trying to survive, and some of them do give in and accept paroles and even join the Confederacy. And these are, I think they're very real human moments of crisis that can speak to us, through the generations. And you read about, again, in these diaries and in these memoirs, that I don't think that we've recognized enough in Civil War history that really come to a head in studying prisons.
We will take one more call from Virginia in Minneapolis. Virginia, we're a little short on time, so jump in with your question or comment.
I had an ancestor in Andersonville, and at the end of the war, he ended up, I don't know how he got to Washington and died, and is buried at Arlington. And I just wondered what happened to at the end of the war, to the prisoners there.
Well, he might have been like some of the, some of the soldiers that I studied. He might have made his way, he might well have gone off to a place like Camp Parole, and then might have been in a hospital. There were Army hospitals, military hospitals. There was one in Fairfax, Virginia, and he might have been in one of those hospitals due to his imprisonment, no doubt. And that's, when he died, and then he ended up in Arlington. That would be my suspicion, and that was the end of his story.
Leslie Gordon, what would you say would be the legacy of Andersonville?
Well, I think Andersonville is some of